Good morning. How's everybody doing today? It's good to see everybody. This is Chris Roddenberry coming at you from Willow Springs, North Carolina. Week 13, personality. Hope everybody's doing well this morning. I see we have Andrea Nicole, Dearica Jackson, and Eli in the audience. Good morning, everybody. How are you doing? I don't know if you've noticed in the chat link, but I sent an interesting article to you that I found in Wired magazine last night. And I was hoping that you might be able to tell me what's going on here. Look at this picture that I've got for you right here. Look at that. Uh, this person was born missing their frontal and part of their temporal lobe. Uh, and the point of this article is, how can this person talk? This person should be having seizures. How is their brain working? Can anybody looking at this picture tell me what psychological principle would explain how somebody could be born with a brain like this and still grow up to have normal language abilities? This person actually has a graduate degree. Can anybody tell me what's going on with this person? Who's going to win the Golden Award this morning by being able to give me the word that explains how a person could have a brain like this and still grow up to have normal functioning? I see we have a couple people in the audience. Come on, Andrea, Dearica, Eli. What is the concept that would explain this particular problem? Can anybody tell me? Waiting for something in the chat bar. Come on, who's going to win the award? Who's going to tell me? Holy cow. Come on now. Andrea, Dearica, Eli, does anybody know what's going on here? I'm looking in the chat bar. The word is plasticity. Do you folks remember when we talked about brain plasticity? And I suggested to you that a brain could reorganize itself to accommodate any sort of injury or developmental problem. That's a good guess. Thank you, Eli. That at least tells me that you are listening. Oh, I could have said that. Yes, don't think too deeply. This is Dr. Roddenberry's psych course, so you don't have to think too deeply, right? Come on now. I'm not that clever. Plasticity. Yep, that's all I was talking about. This is a great demonstration of plasticity. If you're interested, read the article in the chat bar that I've added for you, and find out the front first three are paragraphs of the article. They're talking about how could this happen. The doctors are saying this couldn't be happened. And then towards the end of it, they share with you the magic word plasticity. But as I was reading the article, I was like, oh, my students know this, right? Plasticity, the amazing quality of the brain to rewire itself in response to developmental problems or damage, as long as that damage happens early in life. You know what? Now that you've been in class for almost 3 months now, you should be using some of these terms that you've heard in class to help you understand articles that you read about brain and psychological functioning. You should try it from time to time. When a psychological article comes across your news feed, read that article and see if you can apply what you've learned in this class to that article. You'll be surprised at how often you can do that now that you are a psychology student. Okay, Andrea, Dearica, you still in the classroom? If you are, type me a chat in the bar just to let me know that you're still here. Looks like we have a small audience today, but that's okay. I am glad you are here, Eli, and I'm going to talk just to you, if nobody else. Okay. So let's go ahead and get started on chapter 13, self and personality. Sorry about the recorded. Uh, had to take the dog out. That's okay, completely fine. I am so glad you're here. I just wanted to make sure you were still here if I was going to use your names and reference you in class. I am sorry about Tuesday. I was traveling and could not make it to class. The internet speed was too poorly. But on Tuesday, we talked all about the self and what exactly the self is. And it's basically a set of cognitions, a schema that you have, a set of beliefs that you've learned over your history that help you explain who you are. So if I ask you, Deerica, who are you? You could write down 10 or 15 descriptions of who you are. You would be drawing your self schema. And that sense of self helps provide continuity to your behavior and helps you predict what Deerica would do in this situation, what Deerica wants in this situation, and it helps you, in a sense, organize your behavior. Your sense of self is just sort of a construct that you build over your life that helps you explain who you are. Now, one of the things that psychologists like to do is measure this self to see if we can understand how people are built, if we can understand the structure of personality. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about personality testing. Now, who uses personality tests? Well, you know what? You'll find them in clinical psychology to help diagnose people who may or may not have personality disorders. You may or may not find these in school settings where teachers and administrators might try to create individualized education based upon your personality style. You know what? You are probably going to find this in the business world where some employers will use personality tests to decide whether or not you are a good fit for their company. In fact, I forget the student's name, but we had a student in webinar on Wednesday that said that she was not hired by Buffalo Wild Wings because they did not like her score on a personality test. So businesses are going to use personality tests. And you know what? If you've ever filled out a personality profile on a dating website, some of these dating websites think that they can use personality to provide people with good matches for romantic relationships. So you're going to find personality tests used everywhere. And personality tests are simply designed, a paper and pencil measure typically, designed to try and figure out and describe your personality. Now, personality tests, they try to find out how everyone is like you by creating the personality structure that we all have. They allow us to compare groups of people and find out how some people are like you. And if you take the personality test that I sent to you online this week, we can find out how no one is like you, how you are a unique individual person. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the trait approach today, personality traits, which are these sort of personality qualities that we try to measure. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a theory-driven test, Hans Eysenk's biological trait theory. Then I'm going to talk to you about the big five personality test, and we'll talk a little bit about the difference between what's known as a self-report and a projective personality test. If you come to webinar tonight, you will have completed a self-report test, and in webinar tonight, I'm going to give you a chance to take a projective personality test. Looks like we have William Craig joining the live stream. Good morning, William. How are you doing? I put an article in the chat bar up a little bit higher. I will put it back in there again. It's a neat article about a lady who is missing a good part of her brain, and yet she is still normal. You might find this interesting to read. And yeah, so go ahead and take a look at it, William. You might find it interesting. Now, probably the first real approach to scientifically measuring personalities was pioneered by a fellow named Gordon Alport, who followed what he called the trait approach. And a trait is simply just a dimension of personality that can be measured. And the trait approach asks, how is everyone like you? So what traits do we need to describe everybody's personality? The trait approach allows us to compare groups of people, extroverts versus introverts. So, how are some people like you? And then a good personality test allows us to figure out your unique personality style. How are you a unique person based upon your constellation of personality traits and your pattern of personality scores? And like I said, there are a lot of different psychologists who are interested in personality testing. Now, Gordon Allport, father of the trait approach, he kind of started with a sort of an intuitive approach. He said, you know what? Personality is something we describe. So if I go to the dictionary, I can find out what personality is by looking at the words that we use to describe personality. Now, some people say that there are first 4,500 personality describing words in the dictionary. I've heard estimates of 11,000. I'm not sure. Suffice to say, there are a lot of words in the dictionary that are used to describe personality. Are you uptight? Are you stable? Are you a fiery person? Are you a melancholy person? Are you persnickety or unctuous? Are you happy? Are you extroverted? These are all words you can find in the dictionary that describe personality. And so, if you think about it, that's where we should start looking at words to try and build a theory of what personality looks like. Now, Gordon Alport had a sort of a unique approach. He sort of thought that personality traits could be divided into three qualities: cardinal traits, central traits, and peripheral traits. Now, he said not everybody has cardinal traits, but if you ever met a person that has a really strong personality and there's sort of one trait that sort of defines that particular person, and it is so huge that it's sort of, whenever you think about that person, that's the one thing you think about. Me being interested in sports, I like to think of Michael Jordan. You might think of Michael Jordan as super competitive. If you've ever watched a story about Michael Jordan or heard interviews with Michael Jordan, you'll find that he is the most competitive person in the entire world. I'll bet it probably makes it tough to get along with him personally. But in terms of being an athlete, nobody fights as hard to win as this guy does. So when I think of Michael Jordan, the word that pops into my head is competitive. You can think of that as a cardinal trait. Mother Teresa, the famous nun that helped people in India. She had the cardinal trait of kindness. You know, honestly, my wife has a cardinal trait. I'd call it business mindedness. I've never seen somebody work so hard at being business minded as my wife. Now, not everybody has a cardinal trait. Gordon Allport suggested some people just have these traits that seem to create their entire personality. But what he suggested is all of us have what you might call a set of central traits. Each and every one of you has a certain level of agreeableness. Each of you has a certain level of extroversion, right? Each of you has a certain level of conscientiousness. He would call those central traits, traits that we all have to some degree. And then he suggested that you can think of some personality traits as only coming up in certain situations. I know a gentleman who is a very honest, hardworking, nice guy. But you know what? He cheats at Monopoly or other board games. Whenever we play board games, this little bitty personality trait you don't see anywhere else pops out. It's his peripheral trait. He's a Monopoly cheater. And so Gordon Allport first started thinking about personality by going to the dictionary, and he realized that we could sort of think of traits as acting on three levels. Some traits define who you are as a person and make you totally unique from everybody else in the world, cardinal traits. All of us have a set of central personality traits to some degree, and then occasionally there are personality traits that you have that only come out in certain situations. Now, here's the deal. How do we make a personality test to measure these traits that we're interested in? Gordon Allport wasn't necessarily interested in making standardized personality traits that could tests that could be used in all across the field of psychology, but later psychologists have done. And there are really two different ways to make a test. The first is the data-driven approach, and the second is the theory-driven approach. Let's talk a little bit about the theory-driven approach right now. In a theory-driven approach to personality, what I do is I sit and think about what I think personality should be, and I create a theory of personality, and then I make a test to measure that theory of what I think personality is. Okay, I hope this makes sense, but it'll make more sense as we go on, I think. In a theory driven approach, you start from a theory or explanation of how you think personality works, and then you create a test to measure those parts of your theory. Hans Eysenck is listed in your book, and he's one of the sort of the primary guys to come up with a theory of personality, and then to create a test to measure this theory of personality. Hans Eysenck actually started with the idea that personality is created by your brain. Doesn't that make sense? Your brain is where your personality comes from. So he said we could look at parts of your brain and use those to create an explanation of how uh, peer personality is created. I have a question in the chat bar. Andrea Nicole asks if the Myers Briggs is a theory driven test. Absolutely. The Myers Briggs test was developed based upon the theory of personality created by a fellow named Carl Gustav Jung, who was a good friend and collaborator of Sigmund Freud's for many years. That's a great point, Andrea Nicole. I'm so impressed that you knew that. Yes, so the Myers-Briggs type indicator, the MBTI, was developed after Carl Jung's theory of personality, and it said if personality is this, okay, if Carl Jung says that this is what personality is made of, let's get a test that measures that particular type of personality. Very good, Andrea Nicole. We're going to focus a little bit on Hans Eysenck, but just remember the same concepts as I talk about Hans Eysenck, the same sort of theory of creating a test from a theory of personality is the same thing. Great point, Andrea. So, what Hans Eysenck suggested is let's look at the brain and we can build our theory based on how the brain functions. Now, he noticed that very, very early in life, you can see that children demonstrate two qualities we might say develop into personality. Some babies like to be stimulated, some babies don't like to be stimulated. And there's even a part in the brain called the reticular activating formation that is responsible for causing you to respond to environmental events. And so he said, so we can think about this reticular system, this arousal related system, as part of your personality. Some babies like to be stimulated, some babies don't like as much stimulation. And he said, you can think of that as growing into this adult personality we call extroversion. Extroverts like to go to parties and talk to people. Introverts like to stay home and be in quiet places. Now, Hans Eysenck also noticed that some babies cry a lot and some babies tend to be really, really happy babies. If any of you have ever been around a newborn, some newborns cry a lot and some newborns are relatively happy. He suggested that this is a personality trait called emotional stability. Okay, we might call that neuroticism. And he argued that it's related to your limbic system. Your limbic system includes your amygdala. Remember us talking about your amygdala as your emotional center? Some people have a more sensitive amygdala than others. And he suggested this creates what we might call emotional stability. Now, if you look at this nifty little chart underneath me, you see it's sort of a circumplex model based on two dimensions of personality, introversion, extroversion, or what we might call extroversion, and emotional stability. And it's based on his belief that these two parts of the brain help determine what our personality is. Great theory, and in fact, most modern personality tests include these two dimensions. Now, the only problem with creating a theory driven test is sometimes data will come to show that your theory is limited or just downright wrong. Now, people criticized Hans Eysenck's theory because they said this is a great idea of personality, but what about psychotic people? What about antisocial personality people? Those sociopaths that go out and hurt people and commit crimes. Your test, where on your personality theory would these people exist? So, in a sense, what these people were saying was you have a nice theory and you even have a test developed based on that theory, but your theory doesn't account for these people who exist in the real world. So, do you see the problem with the theory test? We may suggest that the data doesn't fit your theory. And so early criticism said that his test didn't account for people who turned out to be sociopaths. So you'll notice he added a new personality factor he called psychoticism or constraint, your ability to control your impulses. And he argued that this might be related to your dopamine system, which is part of the reward system that is in our brain. And so he developed, so the upshot here is one way to develop a test of personality is to think about what you think personality, where it comes from, and then to develop a test that measures the theory that you have developed. Hans Eysenck suggested that personality is based upon dimensions of the brain, and so he created a test to measure the functions controlled by those three parts of the brain. Okay, and in fact, I've got a little chart here, the reticular activating system. We didn't talk about this. It's not typically included in introductory site text, but it turns out to be a tract of nerves that you'll see right there in your midbrain, going up from your brain stem through your midbrain. Notice down here in the picture, we've got the brain stem, and you've got the pons and the cerebellum, and you notice that green pathway. This is the reticular activating system, and this sort of allows you to get aroused, to respond to environmental stimulus. And in fact, a fellow named Paul Bremer, a French doctor, found that if you cut the fibers in this particular system, the person falls into a permanent coma. So this is responsible for allowing you to respond to environmental stimulation. If you look down here, here's that optimal arousal graph that I've been talking about for several weeks. And you can think about introverts and extroverts as people with reticular activating systems that have different levels of sensitivity. So you can think of an introvert as having a really, really sensitive reticular activating system. It doesn't take much to arouse that person. And so that person's more sensitive system needs less stimulation. That person prefers less stimulation to become optimally aroused. On the other hand, you can think of an extrovert as being a person who has a reticular activating system that isn't as active, and it takes more stimulation to cause their reticular activating system to activate. And so that person needs more stimulation to receive optimal arousal. So hopefully you sort of understand what we're talking about with regard to this idea of a theory, of a personality test based upon a theory of personality. Now, the Big Five, which is the test you're going to take this week, was developed later by these researchers, McCrae and Costa, and they used a different approach. They said, you know what, we're not going to try to develop a theory and then create a test to measure that theory. Instead, we're going to look at the data and let the data tell us what personality should look like. I got Andrea has a question, so I want to check that. That makes sense and kind of explains why I'm more extroverted in some cases. Yeah, we can actually suggest it. Personality comes from your brain, so we can start to make these theories up about what stimulates you. You know, Andrea, if you find this interesting, and I'm not suggesting this is you, but there is a YouTube documentary called The Dangerous Few. And there are doctors who think they can use this idea of stimulation and arousal to explain sociopaths. And these people say that they can use brain scans to identify who is at risk for becoming a sociopath. And what they say is that these sociopaths need to do things that are scary and terrifying in order to achieve the normal arousal that you and I would get from a good conversation. If you're interested, you will find this. I just typed the name of it in the chat bar. You will find this to be an amazing and shocking documentary. Uh, yeah, please. It will blow your mind, and it raises some good questions. One question is, if you notice that a person has an abnormal brain at 3 or 4 and you start giving them treatment, Are you actually labeling people as psychopaths before they ever have a chance to demonstrate that trait? What if I told you at 2 or 3 that you had the tendency to become a sociopath? That's sort of, it raises interesting ethical questions. Should we label people before they engage in these behaviors? All right, now, McRae and Costa's Big Five. What they did was, they said, let's use a statistical technique. Let's gather a ton of data on how people act in different situations, and then let's see if we can use statistics to tell us what their personality looks like. And this is sort of based on the idea. One of the first personality tests was called the adjective checklist, which is where they would take all those different words from the dictionary that describe personality, and they would have people look at these lists and check off the words that describe their personality. And what you'll find is that people tend to check off these personality traits in patterns. So if you checked off that you were extroverted, there's another 10 or 15 traits that are related to extroversion that you would also check off too. And so you can think of people when they endorse personality traits as being theirs or not theirs, people tend to have patterns in how they pick traits. If you're extroverted, there are certain traits you're probably going to pick and certain traits you're definitely not going to pick. Now, the data-driven approach adopted by McRae and Costa uses this logic, and they used a statistical test called factor analysis or cluster analysis. It's a statistical technique I'm not going to worry about explaining to you in here. If you take an advanced statistics class, you may hear about this. And basically, what this test does, what a factor analysis does, is it allows us to look at how people respond to large surveys of traits or situations and find if there are clusters of situations that people tend to endorse together. So you can see which traits seem to clump together. Now, what McRae and Costa did was they had people respond to lots of situations in which they could demonstrate personality. They used a factor analysis, and after the fact, they went and tried to figure out how many different groups of traits were there based on the statistical test, and they tried to name what these traits describe. And so if you ask people to check adjectives or list situations in which they can respond to demonstrate personality, what McRae and Costa found was there appeared to be 5 different clusters of situations which differentiated people from one another. And they named these traits openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism. If you look at how I have them listed, you can see that it forms a mnemonic ocean. Personality is an ocean. And they found that people demonstrate personality in these 5 different clusters, if you will. Openness to experience is the willingness to experience your own emotions and new situations, your interest in different experiences in the world. Conscientiousness, your level of self control and your power to control yourself and your outcomes. Extroversion, your degree to which you seek out stimulation. Agreeableness, the degree to which you'll give up your own desires in order to maintain a friendship. And neuroticism, the degree to which you suffer negative emotions such as anger and anxiety. William Cray's typing in the chat bar saying, I think it makes more sense to use statistics to look for patterns. You know, William, I think you are exactly right. We do not know enough about the brain at this point to really use it as a theory, or at least if we do, we're going to miss something. And I would say that the Big Five used by McRae and Costa is probably one of the most commonly used personality tests in the field. So I would definitely agree with you. Uh, um, William, I also see that you have another comment about the report, which is where they catch criminals before they engage in the crimes. This is exactly the concept that is brought up in the dangerous few. Can you really call somebody a sociopath before they do something bad? Great point. And I think both of those points that you bring up, William, suggest that we don't know enough about the brain to be making decisions like what personality is or who's a sociopath based on their brain functioning. Great points, William. Great points. Now, the test I'm going to have you take is this Big Five personality test, and it's going to give you scores on these major clumps. And what I want you to do is to take this test before you come to class tonight. Now, the Big Five is a very, very popular test. And you know what? Personality, somebody asked in webinar on Tuesday night, is personality learned or is it genetic? You know what? The research suggests, at least with the Big Five personality trait, that personality is genetically determined. Now, if you take my developmental psych class, I will show you how you can help train children out of less useful personalities, some less useful personality styles. But by and large, personality is genetically determined. And if you look at the chart over here, this is a behavioral genetics test looking at the correlation or the concordance of personality traits between people who are identical twins and fraternal twins. And what you'll notice is that identical twins, the correlation of their personality on all five dimensions of the Big Five test show that identical twins, people who share 100% of the same genetic material, are more similar on these personality traits than our fraternal twins. And environment definitely plays a role. My partner jokes that he wants to see a DNA proving that my stepmom isn't my biological mother. That is so funny, Andrea, right? Um, it's all we always tend to pick on people about their personality styles and how they're similar and different. My oldest son is just like me. He has a bad temper and he is a little introverted. On the other hand, my youngest son is just like my mom. And just like my wife annoys the hell out of me sometimes, my younger son annoys the hell out of me sometimes. And my older son, my wife doesn't understand him, but I understand him perfectly. We are two peas in a pod. That's a good question. You know what, William? You're going to notice that actually identical twins, if you look down here on the twin studies, it turns out situation does affect personality a little bit. The bizarre thing, identical twins raised apart actually have more similar personalities than identical twins raised together. That might seem counterintuitive at first, but if you think about it, here's another thing. Older twins are more similar than younger twins. So if you have an identical brother or sister, you are going to be more similar to them on a personality test when you're adults than when you are children. And if you think about it, this makes sense. When kids are living in the same household, there's great pressure, especially with identical twins, to differentiate yourself a little bit. So when you're living in the same house with somebody who's an identical twin, you're probably going to adopt a little different personality styles just because you don't want to be your identical brother or sister. However, if you're not raised together or when you grow up, those personalities that you had, your genetic personalities, kind of drift back to where they really should be. So, what do you think about that, William Cray? If I tell you that identical twins raised apart actually have more similar personalities than those raised together? Pretty freaking crazy, huh? And for those of you talking about the effect that environment has on personality, non genetically related siblings showed no correlation on personality traits. And children who are adopted don't really show a correlation with their parents on personality traits. So I hate to say this, if you're an anxious or introverted person, uh, it's probably built into your genetic system. Now, there are ways in which we can learn strategies and how to manage those initial traits, but they're sort of baked into the system genetically, just like IQ appears to have a genetic component. Andrea says, having known several sets of twins, they all kind of take steps to differentiate themselves. Yes, because parents will do annoying things to increase their similarity at birth. I remember I knew a pair of twins when I was a kid, and they were named Kenny and Denny. Their names even rhymed. Not only were they identical twins, but they had not names that rhymed. I'm sure those boys were looking for any reason to be a little bit different in middle school and high school, right? So good point, Andrea and Nicole. I know, right? Yeah, the parents thought it was cute. The kids probably freaking hated it. Now, that's one type of personality test. Now, let me say, if you take the Big Five test, you're going to notice it is one particular style. It is what's known as a self-report test. Now, why is it the Big Five a self-report test? Well, it's because I asked you to tell me how you would behave in certain situations. When you go to a party, do you like to meet lots of new people on a scale of 1 to 6, with 6 being yes, I do a lot, and 1 being no, I don't? If you've already taken the Big Five test, which I hope you have, you'll notice that it asks you to self describe, to describe how you would behave in certain situations. And it asks you to do that using a numerical scale. This is what's known as a self report test of personality. This is a personality test in which the test taker directly answers and describes their own personality in an overt way. Now, and I'll ask you questions like, how do you usually behave? How did you behave in the past? How would you behave in the future? Or I might even give you a set of adjectives and say, hey, which of these adjectives do you think describes your personality? Now, this is a very direct way to measure personality. And really, if you think about it, uh, that's probably the most obvious way to find out about someone's personality. Ask them how they would behave in situations. Who knows you best? I know how I would act in certain situations, or at least I think I do. And the neat thing is, using these numerical scales, kind of like the Big Five test scores that you got are percentile numbers. So if you're in the 50th percentile, you know your average for that trait. If you're in the 90th percentile, you have more of that trait than anybody else. So I'm in the 75th percentile for neuroticism. I'm more angry and nervous than 75% of the population. It's really easy to compare people to one another, which is what personality test users like to do. There are some disadvantages with using a self-report test, though, folks. Sometimes people really don't know how they would respond. If any of you took that personality test, how many of you read some of those questions on the Big Five test I gave you and said, you know what, I'm not exactly sure how I would respond in that situation? Or how many of you said, well, you know what, it depends. Are you talking about this or are you talking about that? Did any of you have that experience when you took the self-report test that I linked to you? How many of you weren't exactly sure about some of the questions? Because it depends on the situation. Exactly. You know what? The problem with asking someone how they would respond in a certain situation and creating a test like that is you're creating situations where people don't exactly know how they would behave. Just like you, Andrea. They say, you know what? It depends. Sometimes I would do this, but if this was part of the situation, I wouldn't do that. So sometimes, Nick, Andrea, Nicole, you don't know how you would respond. And the rigid test structure may inhibit your ability to describe your personality. Okay, but there's a more obvious reason too. You know what? Sometimes people lie. How many of you saw questions on that test and you said, wow, uh, if I describe that question honestly, it's going to kind of make me look bad? Do you have a bad temper and argue with people? I do. But if you ask me that right up front, I might not want to tell you that about myself, right? I might be motivated to lie. Now, since personality tests are used in hiring decisions and they're also used in court decisions and in clinical psychology, they're used in very important situations. There's often a strong motivation to lie. And I can't stop you from lying on a personality test. The only thing I can do is to try to catch you. And personality tests that are used in clinical situations have lots of what they call validity scales, where they're trying to find out if you are lying on that personality test. So the disadvantage with a self-report test is that sometimes people don't know how they would respond, or sometimes people are going to lie if you ask them directly about their personality. Now, another way you can then measure personality, if you really want to try to get around this fact that sometimes people lie or don't know how they would respond in a situation, what if you give them a real situation and then see how they behave and make a judgment about their personality? Yes, it is very difficult being honest about your personality, Andrea. And in fact, when you took the Big Five personality test, you had to click a couple of boxes before it would take you to the test. One of those boxes said that if you don't like your personality scores, uh, you can't get mad at them and sue them because they're just telling you what you told them. So one of the boxes was, hey, I agree that if I don't like my personality results, that's my problem. You're right. It is difficult finding out the truth about yourself. I took the Big Five when I was 35, and at that point, I found out that I have a bad temper. I labored under the first 35 years of my life thinking that everybody else in the world was the problem. At 35, I just found out I was neurotic and I had some personality problems to work out. So, Nicole, it is definitely difficult being honest about yourself. The second way you can actually try to test people's personality to get around that is to use what's known as a projective personality test. In a webinar on Tuesday night, I suggested to the class that I have a sort of a short personality test that I do the first day of class to figure out which of my students are extroverted and which are introverted. So what I'll do in my seated class is I'll get there before everybody, and as people come into my classroom on day one, I will greet each person individually and try to make eye contact with them. And I look at how people respond to my greeting. Some people are very friendly and strike up a conversation with me. Those people are very extroverted. Some people will say hi to me and make eye contact, but won't say anything else and will go back and sit at their seat. And you know what? Some people have trouble even saying hello or making eye contact on the first day of class. Those people are very introverted. And you know what? The first day of class, I know who my introverts are and who my extroverts are, even though these students don't know they've been in a personality test. Instead, I give them a situation, an informal greeting, and I let them project their personality into that situation. The extroverts project their personality by being very friendly towards me. The introverts project their personality by being standoffish on that first day. I don't take it personally. It just is a way for me to gauge who's an introvert and who's an extrovert. So, Andrea, those of you that are still on the lecture, do you understand how a projective test works? I allow you to project your personality into a situation, an ambiguous situation, and then I try to guess your personality. Now, the problem with this is I'm trying to guess your personality based upon your behavior, and that's not quite as scalable and as easily defensible as if I have your scores on a 6-point scale, but it is a way for me to judge your personality. Now, one of the most famous projective tests and the oldest one is a test known as the Rorschach test. Does everybody see this picture below me? If you would tell me, what do you think that picture looks like? It makes sense. I know that my level of introvert extrovert depends on other things. This is true, Andrea, and that's actually a problem with self-report as well as projective tests. People may be in different moods. Maybe somebody told you something that hurt your feelings. Maybe you just broke up with a romantic partner and you're feeling a little bit paranoid. Yes. Okay. People are saying it looks like a moth. You know what? Sometimes I teach this class in the nursing school, and all of my nursing students say that it looks like a pelvis. Can anyone see the pelvis? Can anyone see the pelvis that I say? Now, here's the crazy thing. Based upon your responses, I can sometimes tell who my nursing students are because my non-nursing students will say, "Oh, it looks like a moth, it looks like a mask." but my nursing students are more likely to say it looks like a pelvis. And so I can use this test to sort of guess what your interest is academically. Some serious looking bone spurs. Yeah, right, Nicole. I get that. Now, here's the deal. This test was developed by a fellow named Herman Rorschach. You can see his picture here, right here. This is Herman Rorschach. In my opinion, just an aside, doesn't he look kind of like a young Brad Pitt? He is easily, in my opinion, the most handsome of psychologists. And he's the fellow that developed the Rorschach test. He spilled an ink container one day, and he noticed that the ink blot kind of looked like something, and he hit upon the idea that this would be a good way to test personality. Now, he developed a personality test that uses 10 ink blots, 10 ink blots. And these ink blots, let me find the test. Where are these test items? It should be here. Why is it not going? Ah, where is that test? Crap. And so what he did was he used this test. It's composed of 10 items, 10 personality items, and I thought I had the entire personality test here. And what he could do was he gave you 10 of these ink blots. You would tell him what you saw, and then he would try to make a guess about what your personality was based upon your scores on these, what you saw on these ink blots. All right. Now, the advantages of these is it's harder to fool the test. If I ask you to tell me what this is, you don't know what the right answer is. And also, if I let you describe in your own opinion what you see, you're not constrained by a 6-point grading scale, right? And so the advantage of this test is it's a more flexible way to measure personality. The problem with this test is I have to guess your personality based upon your score. And what you're going to find is that different psychologists will guess different personalities based upon what people see. If I'm a psychologist and I give you these 10 pictures and I tell you that these pictures suggest you're extroverted, how likely is the next psychologist to come to that same conclusion when they give you these 10 pictures to look at? And it turns out that a lot of times there isn't agreement under people, between people who are using these tests. However, this is another method for measuring personality. Now, what you're going to find is, and tonight I'm going to give you another personality test, projective personality test called a TAT, which is where instead of looking at an ink blot, you're going to look at an ambiguous picture of people interacting and you're going to tell a story about it. Okay. Now, clinical psychologists, when they're trying to measure personality, you know what they do? They typically don't rely on just self-report tests or projective personality tests. What they do is they usually give you multiple personality tests, and they give you projective tests and self-report tests, and then they look for the ways in which these tests agree. And that's how they come to a final decision about what your personality is. Okay? Now, tonight we're going to look at our Big Five personality scores, and we're going to talk about what they mean, how we compare people to one another, and whether or not you have a strong personality style. And then we're going to take a projective personality test and compare those two scores to see where they agree about our personality and where they don't agree about our personality. And I'm going to give you a chance to tell me which test you think is a better measure of your personality. I also hope you bring a lot of questions to me tonight, having taken this personality test, because I have a lot of really good answers that I think will be very helpful for you tonight. Does anybody have any questions about how we measure personality? And again, I want you to know the difference between theory-driven and data-driven tests. And I want you to know the different test styles, self-report versus projective tests of personality. And if you know those two concepts, you really know a good deal about personality testing. Any questions, folks? I'm at 9:47. We're actually going to finish class up a couple of minutes early, but I've been so late so many times that I probably owe you a couple extra minutes. Any questions, folks? I hope you have a great day. I hope when you take the personality test, you discover something about your personality that you didn't know. And I hope you can use that information to grow as a human being. Cool. Hey, have a great day, Deerica. Andrea, thanks for your great questions. William, thanks for your great comments. It was good seeing each and every one of you. And I'm glad you liked it, Andrea. And if you want, even if you came to class on Tuesday, if you want to come back tonight, lecture might be a little bit different, and we'll talk even more about personality tests. You folks have a great week, and I look forward to seeing you tonight. Take care.